Well, welcome to class number 2 on the g.a.p.s diet. For those of you who did not attend the first class, which is about half of you, I will just give a brief little intro as to who I am and why g.a.p.s is important to me. My family and I have been on the g.a.p.s diet for over 2 years, and it's been absolutely incredible, the amount of healing that we've experienced. What really started me on this journey of, investigating healing was when my mom was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease at age 46. And it was pretty shocking for that to happen. She was very active, very healthy, really at just kind of the peak of her life. She was a registered nurse, the director of a cardiac rehab department in Idaho Falls. It was pretty devastating to watch that happen. So needless to say, throughout that journey, we did a lot, my family and I did a lot of reading and researching, trying to understand the brain and brain health and what causes Alzheimer's. And subsequently in our reading, we kept finding all this crossover between, I'm not saying these are the same diseases by any means, but there was a lot of similar findings in research between Alzheimer's and autism. And once we were reading about autism, we were reading about allergies. And once you're reading about allergies, you're reading about autoimmune. And it just kept going and going and going until it was just like this puzzle that I wanted to really figure out. And I was highly compelled to figure it out when my son was born with some pretty severe digestive issues. He developed colitis at about 3 weeks old and had blood in his stool for nearly the first year of life and couldn't gain weight. I mean, it was just kind of one of those scary situations where no matter who we went to, there just really wasn't a complete answer that satisfied the mother heart in me of wanting to help my son. So naturally, I always had stacks of books on my nightstand reading about health and trying to understand the body and the bowel and the digestive system. And I came across a book about the specific carbohydrate diet, which led me to the g.a.p.s diet. And it was there that I finally, for the first time, found what this connection is between all of these different diseases and disorders. And it took me almost 2 years from the time I discovered that information to the time we implemented it, because it's intense and it requires a great deal of time and commitment. So, but I knew that it was what we had to do. So that's kind of how we came to be. Now we're at the point that we keep my son on the diet. He's very stable, absolutely no signs of colitis whatsoever. He's a very normal kid, can eat any, for the most part, g.a.p.s foods. I just am not comfortable with him going outside of the diet. He's so stable right now. I'm just keeping him on it, and I just kind of follow along with him, so he has a buddy on the diet. He is almost 5. He'll be 5 next month. And my husband we all went on the diet together just because I didn't want to have different diets going on in the household. And subsequently, it, in large part, healed my husband's asthma, which was a bonus. We weren't planning on that. He was going along to be supportive. And it helped his asthma. My daughter, she did have some allergies, so she had some pretty legitimate reasons to be on the diet, but now she's just great. So we follow the diet at home pretty much 100%. But when my daughter's out and about, I don't have to worry. There's no more hives. She doesn't break out in hives. She doesn't get the rashes anymore. So across the board, we've all seen tremendous healing. So that's kind of our story about where we've been and where we're at right now. But anyone who's done the diet, by show of hands, I know you're doing the diet. Anyone else? You guys are doing it? Okay, yay, that's great. You know, there's reading the information and doing it are 2 different ball games. So it's a journey, to say in the least. So last time I showed this slide, and I feel compelled to show this at the beginning of every presentation because I have learned personally through a lot of the stress that I've gone through with some of these problems we've had, that you don't heal through diet alone. And I just don't want to give anyone the impression when they walk away here that everything in their world can be solved by the g.a.p.s diet, because you'll be disappointed in the end, if you put 100% of your energy into only the diet and you neglect other areas of your life that contribute greatly to your healing. So I'm not going to take the time to read through all of these, but basically my whole point is there's your physical nourishment, there's your emotional nourishment, there's your spiritual nourishment. And if those are not all addressed, I don't think the body can be in balance. So it's easier said than done. I know I'm still on the journey, but and I know how time-intensive and stressful g.a.p.s can be. And I think I lost sight of this for a long time, and it wasn't until I started addressing some of these other things that our healing kind of progressed a bit faster. So I say this with compassion. The healing has a lot of elements to it, but diet is a pretty big one and a pretty important one. So that's what we'll spend the bulk of our time talking about tonight. For most of you are familiar with the diet, that it was developed by Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride. She was a neurologist and neurosurgeon. She got her medical degrees in Russia and practiced for, I think, 7 or 8 years as a neurologist and neurosurgeon. She started her family, moved to England, and it was when her son was, I think, 3 years old, he was diagnosed with autism. And you would think a doctor being in the field of neurology would have all of the resources that she needed to find answers for her son, but she was hugely disappointed. The more she searched, the more she realized she was not finding the answers that she needed. So she went and got a second postgraduate degree in human nutrition and was able, through her research and her dedication as a loving mother, to develop a diet protocol that eventually healed her son. And I heard a recent podcast from her. Her son is 19 years old now. He has a girlfriend. She says he drives just like any other kid. He's a normal, totally normal functioning individual. So I think her knowledge speaks volumes. There's a lot of information out there in the health food world, but I think when you combine her intellect with her experience, then you've got some pretty sound information. And that's what really compelled me when I read this is a woman who's experienced this and researched it too. So anyway, she now devotes her practice to nutritional intervention of all kinds of diseases. So what Dr. McBride learned in her experience is that people are put into a diagnostic box, is what she calls it. They have an issue, so it's given a name. You see that specialist and you're treated for that, and rarely does it solve the problem long term because the whole person isn't being treated, and typically the underlying cause isn't being treated either. So she calls this the overlapping picture, where most conditions overlap with one another. Rarely does someone have just one problem. And that's exactly what we were learning when we were researching Alzheimer's, and when my son was going through the depth of his issue, we were learning it's not just food reactions, it's so many other things. And so she said, rather than a diagnostic box, let's give this condition a name, the underlying disorder a name, and that's where gut and psychology syndrome came from. She said that patients with g.a.p.s syndrome fall into the gap of medical knowledge. Basically, the underlying connection between all of these diseases that I was talking about was the state of the gut. And I believe it was Hippocrates that said that a long, long time ago, that all diseases begin in the gut. So this is not new information, but it kind of had to be rediscovered by someone like Dr. McBride, and even by the researchers who developed the specific carbohydrate diet. It's just not largely accepted in mainstream, and so it's people like us sitting in little classrooms talking about it and learning about it, but it's the information that we need in order to heal our bodies. Dr. McBride says that a child's digestive system holds the key to the child's mental development. And man, when you read something like that and you have children, you'll just about do anything to help them, because that's the last thing as a mother you want, is your child to be disadvantaged in his or her success in life because he didn't get the opportunity to have a healthy enough gut to develop properly in his brain. A French psychiatrist in 1807 said that the primary seat of insanity generally is in the region of the stomach and intestines. So that was a long time ago, and he knew that. So basically, a brief picture of what's going on. Inside of our bodies, we have several trillion cells, but we have significantly more microbes in our body. In fact, a recent study done in Scandinavia, some of you may have heard Dr. McBride talk about this, shows that 90% of all of our genetic material is comprised of these microbes. That our body is merely the shell to house these microbes. They make up 90% of our genetic material. So it's pretty fascinating when you start to realize that these microbes are everywhere. The largest population of them, of course, is in our digestive tract. They have a symbiotic relationship with all of our cells and our organs. In fact, they comprise a lot of that. So you can't have one without the other. They're very symbiotic in the way that they function. In a healthy body, this microbial world can adapt very readily to whatever it might be exposed to. And which is precisely why two of us can get exposed to something, one person gets sick, one person doesn't. It's all based upon your gut flora and how it handles what it's exposed to. When you have abnormal gut flora, which is also known as gut dysbiosis, if you've heard that term, you basically have an overgrowth of bad bacteria versus the good bacteria. And these bacteria, they release toxic byproducts which get into your bloodstream and cause all kinds of different problems. So basically your digestive system, its nature and function is to provide nourishment and elimination to your body, but when it gets overtaken by this toxic flora, it becomes a source of toxicity rather than nourishment. And like I said before, we can see through this picture that all diseases begin in the gut. How they manifest in you is dependent upon your genetic material, your genetic makeup, and the combination of flora that you have in your body. I don't think I left this quote in here, but it was in the last one that Dr. McBride says, essentially, we're carrying around whatever diseases we may succumb to from birth. And dependent upon how tightly we control the good flora versus the bad flora will kind of depend upon whether that disease manifests itself in our life. So obviously you look at my family and we have a propensity towards Alzheimer's. It's a genetic form that my mom has. So, I better take care of my brain. Other people may have genetic dispositions to, it may be cancer, it may be arthritis, it may be autism, whatever it might be. So it's largely dependent upon how well you take care of your gut as to whether that manifests itself and to the severity that it manifests itself. Dr. McBride talks about this as the roots of a tree. She says that a well-functioning gut with healthy gut flora holds the roots of our health. And like a tree with sick roots is not going to thrive, the rest of the body cannot thrive without a well-functioning digestive system. So your digestive system is the roots of your health. The gut flora is the soil around these roots, giving them their habitat, protection, support, and nourishment. What is a tree without soil? Nothing. So anyway, if you want to understand what it is you're doing on this diet, this is pretty critical. I'm going over this very briefly. I went in a lot more detail last time. But there's essentially 3 types of flora. It can be categorized this way. There's thousands. There's far more than we've ever discovered, and probably more than we ever will discover. But if you categorize them, it can go like this. There's essential and beneficial flora, which is indigenous in our body. It's supposed to be there. It's critical for the functioning of pretty much all functions in our body. And as long as you have the proper amount of that good flora, you're probably enjoying good health and good digestion. And if you're enjoying good digestion, your organs and cells are getting what they need. They're getting the nutrients they need to power and function. So you're a pretty happy and healthy person if you have a good balance of essential flora. Opportunistic flora is also can be indigenous to our body and can serve a lot of good. However, it has the name opportunistic flora for a reason. It's literally waiting for its opportunity to take over. I kind of look at it as the slave to the essential flora. As soon as the essential flora is weakened, the opportunistic flora will take its chance to overpopulate. So as long as that's kept in check, this opportunistic flora, they kind of get assigned jobs from the essential flora, and they do their jobs and they do a good job. But if say like a course of antibiotics does a good job of wiping out good bacteria and bad bacteria, but it does a terrible job of wiping out yeasts. So yeasts are a good example of an opportunistic flora. If you take an antibiotic, you're probably going to have a yeast overgrowth following that antibiotic because they just took their turn to be in charge. So we'll talk later in the presentation about some of the beneficial functions of yeast, so you can kind of learn to understand how these two work together. But when out of control and out of balance, these opportunistic flora do a lot of damage to the body. And then there's transitional flora, which are things that we breathe in the air, things we ingest in our foods, and these are, you know, like viruses, bacteria, different things like that that make us sick, cause colds, flus, all that kind of stuff. These are things that are not indigenous to our body, but if we have enough good flora, it takes care of it. It excretes it, it detoxifies it, gets it out of our body. Again, why one person can get sick and not another, being exposed to the same thing. So we talk a lot about the gut-brain connection. That's probably a term that many of you are familiar with, and I just want to take a minute while we're talking about this to explain what is this gut-brain connection. What is gut and psychology syndrome? Essentially, let me just explain a little bit of the body first. We have a nervous system that consists of your brain, your spinal cord, and your peripheral nerves. This is essentially our information center and our control center for our whole body. Our brain is responsible for more functions than I can even list. I don't even do it justice listing the few things I listed, like thinking, reasoning, making decisions, processing emotions, creativity. The brain also coordinates all the functions in our body. So naturally, this is a pretty big job for the brain. It requires 3 essential things, which is energy, oxygen, and nutrients. In order to get these 3 things, there's an extremely complex and rich system of blood vessels and nerve cells that go throughout the brain. So to put this into perspective, about 25% of your body's blood goes to your brain to keep it functioning. So in a well-nourished brain, these nerve cells have the oxygen, the energy, and the nutrients they need to communicate correctly. And you have a blood-brain barrier, if you've heard that term. That's essentially like the filter that keeps the toxins out and lets the nutrients in so your brain can be nourished. And it protects it from microorganisms that may be in the blood. So what is it that goes wrong? Normally, our nutrients are broken down in our gut and transported in our bloodstream to our brain. Well, we know, science has absolutely proven this. This is not unknown in the medical world, that malnutrition and malabsorption causes degeneration of the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerve tissues. So it's amazing to me that it's still so highly debatable that nutrition and diet can heal the brain. It blows my mind when we know that. We know that malnutrition causes degeneration of the brain. So this is a fascinating thing to me. But abnormal gut flora produces toxic byproducts, which enter our bloodstream. And you got to think, if 25% of your blood goes to your brain, where do you think a large portion of these toxins are going to end up? They're going to end up in your brain, which produces what Dr. McBride calls self-intoxication. And she talks about literally, especially people with severe psychiatric conditions or autism, some of these mental disorders are literally addicts. And that's why following this diet with absolute fanaticism is critical because, well, I'll explain why. Essentially, the glucose metabolism is what our brain uses for energy, and it's a very complex process. But when you have this overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria in your body, this glucose metabolism process gets completely hijacked, and yeasts in particular let off alcohol, which is turned into ethanol, and that's what's traveling to the brain instead of glucose. And so they literally are having addictive reactions to food. They are self-intoxicated, which is why you see behavioral issues. I mean, literally intoxication. So it's pretty fascinating to understand that. But chronic self-intoxication, when it goes on and on and on for an extended period of time, impairs the brain function and impairs the detoxification pathway in the brain. Because when it's overloaded with these toxins, it's no longer detoxifying, it's just accumulating. And it's interesting, our family works closely with a researcher from Harvard who believes in this nutritional connection with Alzheimer's, and he's done an extensive amount of research on it. And he has found in every brain autopsy that he studied, there is a toxic amount of copper in the brain of Alzheimer's patients, an absolute depletion of zinc, which balances copper, and there is essentially no B5 and B7 that exists in the brains of these people with Alzheimer's. So it's fascinating. I mean, it just proves this point that the detoxification pathway is broken in the brain. It's literally just accumulating and accumulating and accumulating until they become symptomatic, and then the disease progresses. So anyway, so when brain function becomes impaired, you start to have behavioral and language problems, poor sensory processing. And sensory processing is becoming just a dime a dozen now. I mean, it's everywhere you go. The kids are suffering from sensory processing. Brain fog, poor memory, seizures, epilepsy, depression, and other psychiatric conditions. Interesting to note, if you look at this and say, well, I have a lot of digestive problems, but I don't have a lot of brain issues, Dr. McBride is writing a second book called Gut and Physiology Syndrome. The diet protocol is the same, but she's going to address those people who have the severe digestive issues, but it manifests itself in different organs in the body besides the brain. So look for that. I don't know when it will be out, but I know she's working on it. So the treatment for this is the g.a.p.s diet, which the purpose of it is to clean up and heal the digestive tract so it stops being a source of toxicity and becomes a source of nourishment. And secondly, to remove the toxicity that's already stored in the various tissues. So I don't know how familiar, those of you on the diet are very familiar with what we eliminate on g.a.p.s. I will just briefly go over this, but I go into a lot more detail in my other presentation. But we eliminate all grains, all starchy vegetables. When I say all grains, I'm not just talking gluten-free grains. I mean all grains, rice, everything. Starchy vegetables, potatoes, yams, anything high in starch. This is not a complete list, but this gives you kind of an overview. Starchy beans and peas, lactose, which means milk, commercial yogurt, buttermilk, sour cream. You get to the point where you introduce milk back in again, but it's always made into yogurt or kefir, homemade, so that lactose is consumed. Sugar is a given. I don't even need to explain that one. But Dr. McBride, I talked about this fanatical adherence to the diet. She talks about it's so important that not a speck of these foods get into your diet, especially initially. In fact, quite frankly, at least the first year plus, because it's so critical for the healing of the body and for the reestablishment of good flora. Because these bad flora we're talking about, this is what they eat. They feed on starches.
Question. So, like a primal diet, it sounds...
It's very similar to a primal diet. It's different in philosophy. The primal diet is, I won't even get into that, but this is it's a therapeutic healing diet, whereas the primal diet is more of like a lifestyle philosophy on food. But the food is very similar. In fact, I use a lot of primo and paleo blogs to get recipes off of. There's a lot of crossover. Not 100% crossover, but a lot, especially when you get into the later phases of the diet. But anyway, so that's kind of the gist of why in my other presentation I go into detail of why we eliminate starches. There's a whole scientific theory that was discovered in the like 1950 or so by a doctor that discovered his patients with digestive disorders could tolerate proteins and fats and not starches, and so he created the specific carbohydrate diet. So watch that other presentation, because I think that's a pretty critical piece of information, understanding the difference between a monosaccharide and a disaccharide, but I'm not going to take the time to explain it because half of you have already heard it. Anyway, what you do eat on g.a.p.s is meats, particularly grass-fed, pasture-raised meats and fish, bone broth, eggs, non-starch and low-starch. There's not really an entirely non-starch vegetable, but lower starch vegetables, fruits and berries that are ripe. So their sugars have been fully developed, so they're a monosugar, not a disugar. Fermented foods, nuts, seeds, certain beans, come later in the diet. Honey, fresh pressed juices, herbal teas, fats and oils are a pretty critical part of the diet that come from clean animal fats, ghee, butter, coconut oil, olive oil, and of course homemade yogurt and kefir, which is largely why we love real foods, because they stand for all these things, and they provide this opportunity for us. That some people can't find raw milk and can't find access to things like this, so we're pretty lucky to have this resource here. And not just this resource, but I mean, they live it, they believe it, so it's really nice. I'm giving you the picture here of the g.a.p.s intro stages 1 through 3. I want to see how much time we have. You start the diet out pretty elemental. I'm not sure, you say you're in phase 4, where you 1? I hear you. I hear you. We were slow. We were slow too. What about you?
Myself, I'm in about stage 3. I've got my kids
Good. Yeah. It moves at different paces for everyone. And what about you? 1? Okay, good. Oh, I can tell you're tired over there. I know that feeling. I really, really do. So stage 1 lasts really, truly a different amount of time for different people. I know people who push through it in 3 days. We were like you. We took our sweet time. Stage 1 might possibly never have ended if my kids really didn't need more food. We just would have kept on. But we took the very slow and methodical route, which it kind of depends upon the individual, how you do it. Some people digress going so slow and need to push through faster. Sometimes emotionally, sometimes we moved on to phases merely for the emotional aspect because my kids needed more food. And I personally would have been fine staying where we were, but we pressed forward just for their emotional sake. So stage 1 is broths, soups made with your broth, boiled meats, the soft tissues off the bones, which if we have time, I'll show you. Non-fibrous vegetables that are very well boiled, very broken down. You want to break down the fiber and the cellulose. This is the opposite of everything you'll hear from a raw foods perspective, so you know. And I will just say we were raw foodists at one point in time, so I understand. But we did not heal at all. We digressed very readily on the raw foods diet. So I embraced very readily the cooking the vegetables to smithereens. And like when we boiled carrots, it was for 3 to 4 hours. When we did broccoli, it was literally till it was falling apart. And that was the state our digestive tract was in order to digest the food. And in essence, if you look at it this way, you're giving your digestive system a break. You're kind of pre-digesting everything for it. Now, a lot of people say, what about the minerals that are lost? We would always use our boil water. We'd throw it back in our soup so that we wouldn't lose those minerals. But it just broke it down, and it made the biggest difference. I mean, I can't even tell you, within a week, our bloating and gas was gone, and we'd had that for like 3 years. So, I mean, it was just like a testament to me, like this is what our bodies needed. So that's stage 1.
So how would you know to go from stage 1?
If you're feeling pretty good, just keep going. And honestly, people who don't have a lot of food allergies can move through quite a bit quicker. So. Okay, sorry, so the camera knows. She said, how would you know to move on in the diet? And that would be my answer is if you feel good or if you're not reacting highly to foods, go ahead and keep adding them in. We were one food at a time. I don't know if that's kind of the approach you're taking, but we were like so reactive to so many different foods that it was literally like plain broth. Okay, now we can put an onion in our broth. Okay, now we can try carrots. And in 3 days, we'll try green beans. And, you know, it was that methodical for us.
And when you say reactive, are you saying, is that the gas and the bloating that you're talking about?
With everybody, it's different. Like ours was diarrhea and then became constipation. Gas bloating would be a pretty good sign. Gas is a pretty good sign. Your digestive tract is not quite ready for it. But the good news is we have yet to have a food where we may have reacted initially that within a few weeks we weren't reacting. Some was a few months, you know, like nuts and seeds and dairy and all that came later for us. But, you know, I remember when we introduced butternut squash, we all totally got gas from it, and then we waited 2 or 3 weeks, introduced it again, and it was no problem and hasn't been since. So that's the hardest part, I think, especially in the initial phases, and it's hard for kids. It's hard to introduce a food and then say, actually, you can't have it anymore. So it's a really delicate balance, but there's a lot of rapid healing that occurs. In fact, look at my first presentation. I show you a sample I should have left that in, I don't know why I didn't, of live blood analysis. I had live blood analysis done prior, like the week before we started g.a.p.s, and then a month into g.a.p.s. And I still felt terrible. I was surprised at the amount of healing that occurred because I was so weak and tired and exhausted and just like, oh. But when I went back, the doctor that did the live blood analysis, he was absolutely blown away.
So you're talking about uniform
Yes,
cells?
yes,
Not
they
clustered?
were totally clustered before. I mean, entirely clustered. There was no oxygen getting into them. And I had, in the region of the bowel, he called moderate to severe bowel disease. And constant stomach pains, just constant. And within 1 month, they were completely separated, oxygenated, bowel disease indicators were gone. Was I entirely healed? No. But it was working. I mean, it was oxygenating the blood cells, which is what we needed. So anyway, I say that just to point out that you don't always feel good on these intro phases. It's pretty exhausting, especially when you're mom doing it. Because I mean, I remember times just laying there being like, if I don't get up and make another batch of bone broth, we're gonna starve. Because it's gonna take me 24 hours. So I better get up, but I'm really tired and I just wanna sleep. So it's hard. I know how hard that is, and there's nothing quick. There's no such thing as a quick snack on g.a.p.s, and which anyone who has children knows they're constantly at your feet. My husband and I call them little birds. They're like, you know, with their mouths chirping open, feed me a worm, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I'll get back to you 3 hours later. I've got to boil some carrots for you. So, I mean, I know how hard it can be. It's intense. It requires such a great amount of planning, and then when you're doing it, you're experiencing die-off symptoms yourself, and you're tired. And I think the first 8 weeks are the hardest. The first probably 3 to 4 months are still challenging. It wasn't until about 6 months into it that I realized one day, I'm like, I actually feel pretty good. Like, I didn't realize I felt good because it's so slow and subtle sometimes. And honestly, it was at about the 2-year mark that I was just like, oh my word, like, my son really seriously does not have colitis anymore. Like, he's healthy. You know, it was so slow. And there's so many bumps in the road too that sometimes you panic on those bumps and you think, are we digressing back to where we started? But the body just has an amazing way of healing and the detoxification. I mean, I will say it was interesting to me that at about the 2-year mark, I mean, I was at the point where I'm like, I could move on. I could move past this diet, but since my son, we're keeping him quite strictly on it still, I just decided I'll hang along with him. And I went through this like massive detox again at about 2 years. But after that, oh my word. Like, I think that was the most dramatic, like, detoxification period in terms of how I felt afterwards. So I thought, well, maybe I'll just stay on this forever.
Did you do anything specific at that moment?
I did some pretty specific liver cleansing at that moment, which I look back and think maybe I should have done that initially, but I don't know that I was strong enough to do that then. So I don't know that I would change the path, but I think maybe the next class will go into some detoxification because I do think I've learned some things that I wish I would have known to support myself through the detoxification a little better at the beginning. But anyway, so it really ebbs and flows. It's a very individual thing. I know there's an online ebook you can buy by healthhomehappy.com, I think is the website. She does the intro phase 1 through 6 in 30 days. And I mean, it was a year for us, 1 through 6. I know you're in 4 and you've been on it for several months. So I think that's a bit fast, but it probably worked for them. So it really just depends on kind of what it is that you're trying to treat. So as you can see here, in stage 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, it all just adds on to each other. You continue with whatever you were doing, and in 2, you start to add in egg yolks, and you start to cook your food a little bit differently. The reasoning behind that is boiled meats are the easiest to digest because they're cooked long and slow over low heat. And then eventually you get into being able to roast meats and even grill meats again, but it's all about ease of digestion. So if it seems strange to you that you can boil meats and not roast them, that's kind of the idea why. You work on increasing a probiotic supplement, which we'll go through the supplements in a minute. You add fermented fish, you add ghee. In stage 3, you add in avocado. You start to cook your eggs differently. You start to eat the cabbage from the sauerkraut because by now you might be able to tolerate some of the fiber because up until now you've largely eliminated fiber. Anyway, then you start to make pancakes out of nut butter, eggs, and squash. We waited on that for a little while. That wasn't exactly phase 3 for us. Like we went on to phase 4 before we'd done that just because we had problems with nuts. So you may have to, it's not gonna be foolproof, but I kept this picture in from last time to see that your guys' fridges look like this right now. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's real. This is really our fridge. It's like that whole entire bottom shelf is bone broth. The top shelf is some leftover soups, which honestly, I can't even believe we had leftover soup, seriously. Like, I don't know if it was like that for you guys, but we were so hungry at the beginning. It was like, it's just an extraordinary amount of food. Yeah, so I don't know, somehow we had leftover soups in there. Some meat, some eggs, we must have been in phase 2 or maybe 3 because I see an avocado, but some sauerkraut. That was it. I mean, that really was it. So, but I do say that it really simplifies your life. There's really no question about what you're gonna eat. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, soup, more soup. Okay, stage 4. We will go into a little more of stage 4 through 6 because that was kind of the goal of tonight, is to get through more of the intro phases. I will say, just to have compassion for you in phase 1, I refuse to look in cookbooks, blogs, anything in these phases because nothing applies to phase 1, phase 2, you know, and even phase 3. It was just like, it was too much for me to look at all those other foods, so I just didn't initially. I just waited until we could and then, you know, then look at them. But so you continue with what you've been doing, but here's where you can start to roast or grill meats. But you want to be careful about them browning too much or having blackened bits on it. We all know the blackened bits are carcinogenic. But if it's too brown, it kind of changes the protein structure in the meat, so you just want to be careful with that. You can start to add olive oil. Some people have already added olive oil by this point. It's kind of dependent upon your body, and a lot of people have already added coconut oil. There's not really a definitive phase to add coconut oil. It just kind of depends on where you're at. Coconut oil causes significant detox, especially for people with a lot of brain problems. If like autism and things like that, they typically react very highly to coconut oil because it's antibacterial and causes a significant amount of die-off. We never really had a lot of problem with coconut oil, so I honestly can't remember when it was that we introduced it, but I don't know, it wasn't really a huge problem for us. So just kind of play the oils by ear as to when you introduce those. Fresh pressed vegetable juices, which if you're dealing with constipation, introduce those earlier. And I'm gonna get into constipation in a while. Something about Heber makes me talk about constipation. We talked about it for like a half an hour last time. I don't know what it is about all of you, but anyway, here's where you can start to try baked goods with ground nuts. Again, we waited a little bit longer for this, but the first thing we introduced with nuts is we made our own homemade nut butters, which I'll have to demo one of these times because, oh, it's delicious. And we made them with the blanched almonds, not the almonds with the skins, because the skins were harder to digest. So that was.
Do you soak them before you do that, or?
If I'm making almond butter out of whole almonds, I will. But the blanched ones, they've already been kind of, yeah, they've already been like boiled, I think is what they do. So I don't worry about it with that. And in terms of your nut flours, good luck. If anyone finds an organic, soaked, sprouted nut flour, let me know.
They have some downstairs, don't they?
They have nut flour, but it's probably
I
not
thought they had some sprouts.
been sprouted. They have sprouted flours, like grain flours.
Okay, maybe that's it.
It's hard to make your own nut flours. they just start turning into almond butter and nut butters pretty quick before you can control the consistency of them. And if you really want your breads to turn out, the blanched almond flour honestly is the best. And really, like when our bodies were ready for it, we haven't had a problem with it. And so if I'm doing something on my own, I'll sprout the nuts, but otherwise I just don't worry about it, and it digests just fine for us. Stage 5 is when you're going to start adding in fruit. And this is if I could really overly simplify the differences between SCD, specific carbohydrate diet, and g.a.p.s, is fruit and dairy, of course. But fruit is eliminated for quite a while on g.a.p.s, and rightly so. Fruit can feed the microbial overgrowth, and you have to be really careful. And honestly, you guys probably feel this way. I know I did. After going through the first few weeks of g.a.p.s, you just think, I don't ever want to do that again. So I will adhere. I will do what it says. So if you're dealing with constipation, though, you may add in some juices that contain some fruits. And Dr. McBride's thought on that is you kind of got to weigh out the problem. If introducing some fruit is going to help you with your constipation, it outweighs the potential feeding of the bacteria, because you're going to work on that over such a long, slow period of time. But if you're toxic in your bowel from the constipation, that's a higher priority. You can kind of play it by ear with fruit. But she recommends that you peel it and you stew it initially. You don't eat it raw. And that you add fats with it. If you're tolerating fats well, you add fats with it. And the reasoning behind that is that controls the blood sugar spike. The fat actually surrounds the sugar molecule, so it breaks down slower over a longer period of time in the body. So that's kind of the reasoning behind that. But you will also hear contrarian advice that if you eat fat with fruit, you can't digest fruit. So I tend to go with Dr. McBride's recommendation.
That just a little confusion. I thought she said when you eat a super ripe banana or the applesauce or whatever,
to eat it alone. Mm-hmm. And she still makes that recommendation. She's meaning don't eat your fruit with your meal, but she's still.
But you can still have a little fat.
Yeah, add the fat with it. If you have zero blood sugar issues, which honestly most people with gut problems have to some degree some blood sugar issues. If you have zero blood sugar issues, you're probably fine just eating the fruit, but it makes it taste good. When you stew apples and put some ghee in it, oh, it's yummy. So anyway, and this is where you start to add raw vegetables in, and just be very methodical about this too. I love salads and I love raw foods, but I remember just drooling over the thought of eating a salad for a long, long time. But just go with what your body can handle with that, and it might be pretty slow. The introduction of raw foods was pretty slow for us. So I would say we were well into the full diet while we were still introducing raw vegetables. Again, this is where you introduced raw vegetables before. Here you start to introduce raw fruits. But again, you may introduce these earlier dependent upon a specific condition that you're treating. She says no citrus here, but she also recommends grapefruit juice for people with constipation. So people's citrus tolerance is very different. So don't force citrus on yourself to relieve constipation if you have pretty bad reactions to citrus. So you have to kind of do what works for you. Stage 6, you continue with the above. This is where you start to add raw fruit in. She says to start with apple, but I suppose if it were summertime, you could do a different fruit, depending upon what's in season. And this is where you start to introduce sweets like g.a.p.s, your sweetbreads, cupcakes, cookies. There are some good g.a.p.s desserts. I'm just going to say that, but you have to be careful because you can overdo it really quickly. We've learned that we just have to keep the sweets to a minimum. We do enjoy them, but they're not like a daily. I look at some of these blogs and they say what they eat for breakfast. I'm like, that is a serious treat for us. That's like an every once in a while thing, but you're eating it every day for breakfast. So I guess people's tolerance is different, but we found we stay in a happy balance if we don't overdo the sweets and the nuts. So the full g.a.p.s diet is all the g.a.p.s allowed foods, and this is kind of where you start to introduce soaked and fermented beans, and that's pretty much the main difference. And you just keep introducing foods, just keep trying foods that you haven't previously introduced. And her recommendation is you keep with the broth. I mean, I know we got to the point where it was like, I cannot drink one more cup of broth. So we do take periodic breaks, you know, but we eat soup a lot too. And so I'm not so concerned about the quantity of broth now that we drink, because we're kind of at that point of maintaining a balance, but we eat soups a lot, and so we're getting the broth. And when I cook vegetables, I use broth a lot in it. So, and I know when it hit summertime for us, it was really hard to drink the broths. And I just didn't force it with my kids, because I mean, they were already being troopers, you know, and so if they didn't feel like it that day because it was 95 degrees outside, I didn't force them to drink it, because we'd already at that point. It is a true advantage when you guys started the diet. We started about the same time, because you kind of, in the colder months and even the spring months when your body can still tolerate the heavier foods, it's just, it would be hard to start this in the summer to me, because it was hard. And it's interesting, if you kind of study the history of broth was used during times of mineral deficiency, when they didn't have access to all the fresh fruits and vegetables. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting little piece of information. Dairy introduction, very dependent upon the person. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail. This goes through the protocol. We waited several months. It was probably, I think, 8 to 9 months before we introduced dairy, and it worked very well. We've gone on and off of milk, kefir. Sometimes we can handle it, sometimes we can't, so we just roll with it instead of getting stressed about it and forcing it. But yogurt has always been tolerated very well. Butter, not tolerated very well by my son, but ghee, yogurt, just fine. So it won't be perfect, but anyway, you can kind of, some people introduce dairy right from the start. We waited, we just had severe enough digestive problems, we just waited, because it can be pretty variable with people, and sometimes if you don't eliminate that, you won't know if that's an underlying problem. So I recommend eliminating it temporarily at least. But supplementation, you're going to be eating a lot of fermented foods, and the yogurt provides that too, but also she recommends a therapeutic strength probiotic, and she goes through it in her book. Look for several billion units in the probiotic. So basically you just want to replenish from every source you can, from food, from supplements, whatever, because you'll absorb different bacteria differently. So you work your way up very methodically on the probiotics. The essential fatty acids, she recommends cod liver oil to help with your vitamin A and D balance. A fish oil with the EPA-DHA ratio. And Real Foods just started carrying a new brand that I'm really interested in trying. Is it Minami or something like that? Minami, or what's that brand called? I don't know. Anyway, they have a new fish oil that's by the Garden of Life company, I think. Anyway, I'm kind of interested. It's not fermented. The cod liver oil that I recommend is that Green Pastures that's fermented. This one's not fermented, but what you're largely looking for is the EPA-DHA ratio, which is so essential for your brain. A nut seed blend, some people tolerate these, some people don't. We just didn't even worry about it. So I don't know, you can kind of do what you want with the nut seed blend. Vitamin A comes from the cod liver oil. We had to do digestive enzymes in the form of hydrochloric acid, and we still do. My daughter and my husband are fine, but my son and I stay on them. When we go off of them, things just kind of start to change, the bowels start to change, so we just stay on them. Sauerkraut juice and broth stimulate hydrochloric acid, so you can try that as a natural measure before you go to the hydrochloric acid. If you need extra vitamin and mineral supplements, you can if you have a specific thing you're trying to address, but just be selective of the brand, that it doesn't have a lot of fillers and things like that in it. I'm not going to go through this. I went through it in my last presentation, but these are just some protocols to assist with detoxification. Pretty important to support your body through that. I'm going to go through some of the frequently asked questions that I've been getting a lot through email. And if we'll have time, hopefully we can answer some of your questions too. I thought this was a really interesting thing that I read, found on Dr. McBride's website. She says that every g.a.p.s person needs to find the right individual balance between meats and vegetables. And it is a tricky balance, especially at the beginning when that's essentially all you're eating. And I found that we tolerated meats better than vegetables, and now I can kind of see why. She says that if you're approaching this diet predominantly with malnourishment is your issue, you probably need more building foods, which are animal foods. If you're approaching this diet predominantly from a toxicity standpoint, then you're probably going to do better with a higher balance of vegetables to meat. I'm like, that was a pretty cool piece of information I wish I would have had 2 years ago. So, I mean, I don't know how foolproof that is. I don't know if you can just adopt that as a 100% rule, but, you know, I did notice, like, vegetables were harder for us to tolerate initially than meats. So, I don't know. You just kind of have to figure out what's right for your body. I don't think that's a hard, fast rule, but it's just something to consider. And honestly, how can you entirely distinguish whether you're malnourished or toxic? Because quite frankly, we're both. But I do think that malnourishment was probably our primary issue going on, and toxicity was kind of a subset of that. So I don't know. Do with that what you want, but I just thought it was kind of an interesting piece of information. Bloating, gas, and constipation. I don't know if these are issues that you guys have dealt with. This is what I wanted to point out, talking about how opportunistic flora can actually work for our good. A lot of people complain of bloating on g.a.p.s. And Dr. McBride explains that this is largely due to yeast activity in your digestive tract. And she says that yeasts are some of the most effective detoxifiers of heavy metals. So the yeasts are sometimes there for a reason. And I know in my perspective, I was going after yeast with a vengeance. I was like, you are not going to live in my body. But she's saying there can be sometimes a physiological purpose for them to be there. And so so you're sitting here attacking these yeasts, but what you really need to be addressing is possibly a heavy metal toxicity issue in your body, because that's why the yeasts won't die, because they're trying to do their job. So I think that's kind of interesting. But she talks about, I mean, sometimes when you feel super bloated and you can just feel itchy and just yuck. She said that the garlic enemas with bicarbonate of soda can help. Just a little, she has some protocol information on her website on that. Gas, and we kind of talked about this. If you introduce a new food and then you get gas, it's probably pretty clear that that food caused it. If it's pretty persistent all the time, you might just have to force through the diet and hope that it takes care of itself slower over time. But be aware that fruits, nuts, and baked goods, you know, with honey and things like that, can sometimes cause gas. Constipation. Constipation, I think, is probably the number one question that I've been getting through email. I don't know, I don't want to embarrass anyone and have you, by raise of hands, how many of you are constipated? But I've borne all, and I'm on YouTube about it, so there's no shame here. It is the most fascinating thing to me, and it's probably because I had to deal with it. I had diarrhea prior to g.a.p.s and developed constipation on g.a.p.s. And it's been this really long process trying to figure it out. I'll figure it out and then I'll digress again, and I'll figure it out and I'll digress again. And I've never been able to quite understand it. So seeing how many people were dealing with it, I've done a lot of research on it and gave you a constipation handout even, dedicated, that extra handout you have. But this is Dr. McBride says that constipation is always a sign of deficient gut flora, which we know, that's kind of what we're doing with the diet, and an imbalance of the intestinal nervous system. Constipation must be treated to avoid further toxicity in the body. Okay, so I gave you a handout on a lot of protocols on how to treat constipation. These are things I've tried. These are Dr. McBride's recommendations and recommendations from people in the Yahoo group and the Facebook group. I just kind of compiled a whole bunch of things because what works for some might not work for another, but I really think her information on the nervous system is so fascinating. I found 2 key pieces of information which makes sense to me why people may develop constipation on g.a.p.s and why it is so hard to permanently treat it. So if I can talk really quickly, I'm going to try to explain it, because this is not just constipation, what I'm about to say. This plays in large part a huge role in a lot of health conditions that are synonymous with g.a.p.s conditions. So let me just take a quick second to explain the nervous system. The nervous system has 2 divisions. Our voluntary system, which basically is our conscious control, like I can consciously move my arm. That's the voluntary nervous system. Or the autonomic or involuntary nervous system. These are functions that happen that aren't consciously controlled by us. They just go on constantly, like our blood pressure, our heart rate, our digestion, all of those things. We don't have to consciously think about those things. They just happen. So within the autonomic nervous system, we have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And these are kind of antagonists, but they balance each other out. It's a really interesting thing when you start to study it. So the sympathetic nervous system is largely our fight or flight response. When you have something stressful going on, the sympathetic nervous system is activated. And the physiological symptoms of a sympathetic nervous system being activated, they vary, but basically what it does is it draws blood away from the less vital organs and gives them to the most vital organs, like your brain, your heart, your lungs, things like that. So when the sympathetic nervous system is activated, your digestive system slows down. And the energy is basically the energy that was once used for your nourishment and your elimination is largely halted in order for the energy to go to whatever the stressful situation is that you're dealing with. Now, we think about fight or flight as like totally primal, like running from a lion or something like that, but our fight or flight responses are different now. I mean, it's our daily stresses. It's the stress of carrying out the g.a.p.s diet. It's, you know, all of these kinds of things. And so your body can become used to being in a sympathetic state. Having the sympathetic system kind of the dominant system functioning. You can't say exactly that 100% of your sympathetic system is going and none of your parasympathetic. It's just this symbiosis. There's always some actions of both of them going on, but your sympathetic system will dominate because it's dealing with your survival as it sees it. So what does it do to help you with your survival? It activates the adrenal gland, which pumps out adrenaline. And so that's why you see so often adrenal fatigue. And this can even contribute to chronic fatigue and things of this nature. So that's why I say this information I'm talking about with a platform of constipation, but it applies to so many things. Your feelings when you're in a sympathetic state are typically feelings of nervousness, of stress, even panic. You can't sit still, and it can even lead to exhaustion, ironically, because it's supposed to keep you activated, but it can exhaust you pretty quickly because your body is not meant to stay in the sympathetic state for long periods of time. So the parasympathetic nerves, their job is, again, this antagonist to return your body back to normal. So it slows down your heart rate, lowers your blood pressure, calms your nerves, and reactivates all those non-essential unconscious functions in your body, including your digestion. Its primary job is to nourish and kind of rejuvenate your body. It's the builder. It's kind of what we're shooting for with g.a.p.s. We're trying to get our bodies out of this state of stress and get it into this state of rejuvenation where it can heal. So this is why Dr. McBride explains that people with constipation are largely dominated by their sympathetic nervous system and need to rebalance their parasympathetic nervous system. So what does nutrition have to do with the autonomic nervous system? This is what I found to be critical because I had read about this, and there's a lot of things you can do to activate your parasympathetic nervous system with a lot of those things I talked about at the beginning, your emotional and your spiritual nourishment and things like that, but there's also a nutritional component to it as well. If you look at the four main electrolyte minerals, we've got magnesium and calcium, which are kind of antagonistic to each other. They balance each other out, and we've got potassium and sodium. These ratios must be balanced. So people with digestive problems, as Dr. McBride says, they need an increased amount of magnesium and potassium. And those are just two minerals for a long time to me. I didn't quite understand why we needed more of those. But it's interesting to note that magnesium and potassium activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And it's calcium and sodium that activate the sympathetic nervous system. So when you're dominating sympathetically, you need an increased amount of magnesium and potassium to activate your parasympathetic system. This is not to say you don't need calcium and sodium, but you need more of the other to help balance it. The more I studied magnesium, the more I realized it is like a rock star nutrient. It does so many things. And I'll tell you the most alarming thing that I learned. it is known in the medical community that magnesium is the #1 mineral deficiency in the United States. And I just think, then why is that not a first effort for treating conditions? Because when you start to learn what magnesium does, it plays a role in so many functions in your body. I don't even have time to get to a fraction of it. But we all know that people with gut disorders have a severe lack of B6 in the gut. That's like one of the first things that even a traditional doctor would tell you is you're lacking B6. Well, guess what has to be there to produce B6? Magnesium. You cannot have B6 without magnesium. It's fascinating. So anyway, it helps transport the fat-soluble vitamins. It properly channels calcium. So if you're dealing with osteoporosis or bone density issues, you need to understand the magnesium-calcium ratio. Basically, most minerals and vitamins are dependent upon magnesium for their proper function and transportation. Keeps the sympathetic system at bay. If you look at a chlorophyll molecule, which is any dark green vegetable, the center molecule is magnesium. So it's like the center of life, basically. I just think it's fascinating. Anyway, it activates your antioxidant pathways, so thus increases your ability to detoxify. So what is it that depletes magnesium? And this is other minerals as well. I'm kind of picking on magnesium right now, but you have to have all the minerals. But stress, of course, poor absorption in the gut. And mineral absorption is complex. I don't have time to explain it, but it's really interesting when you start understanding what it takes for the body to absorb minerals. Even a healthy adult with a functioning gut probably has a fairly hard time absorbing minerals because it's quite a process. But it's really interesting. Some of the key elements to absorbing minerals are to have enough beneficial flora because they create acids which release the minerals. So what do you do when you make bone broth? You put acid in the water to release the minerals. That beneficial flora in our gut does the same thing in order for the minerals to be leached from the food. So anyway, poor absorption it's a huge problem. The pathogenic overgrowth, of course, will cause you to not be able to absorb because of what I just talked about. Excess calcium will deplete your magnesium because it will pull magnesium out of wherever it can to try to balance that calcium ratio. And I don't know this, so I'm a little bit fearful going on YouTube quoting this, but I wonder if that's why people develop constipation on g.a.p.s or have persistent constipation throughout their whole life because they're totally magnesium deficient. And so when you introduce very calcium-rich foods and you're eating a lot of bone broths and yogurts, which have their calcium to magnesium ratio is like 11:1, that you don't have enough magnesium to balance it out. And if calcium activates the sympathetic nervous system, it's going to shut down your digestive system, not entirely, but it's going to really slow it down. So you're probably not going to be moving your bowels. So to me, it makes perfect sense. But anyway, so I've been supplementing for the last little while because I didn't want to just come out and say all this information with zero experience on it. And it has made a night and day difference. I mean, absolute night and day difference. I got my vitamin D level tested about halfway into g.a.p.s and started supplementing with vitamin D, and it made quite a difference to the point that I wished I had done that earlier. But then when I started supplementing magnesium, it was like significantly more difference. And magnesium has to be in balance for your body to properly use the vitamin D. Anyway, there's a lot of information out there about magnesium, but Dr. McBride and several of the sources I've read from all agree that if you're going to take a magnesium supplement, it needs to be a magnesium chelate supplement. It's one that the body can absorb. If anyone's ever taken Epsom salt as a laxative, has anyone ever done that? Ow. Yeah, it hurts. Like, yeah, diarrhea sometimes, it's painful. Well, basically what's happening, Epsom salts can be good. They can be great for baths and things like that, or as an absolute necessity if you're that constipated, but I'd probably do an enema over that. The body takes what it can, but it's not all absorbable, and so it just flushes the rest out, and that's what causes that pain in your bowel and that intense flushing. But if you take a magnesium chelate supplement, it's highly absorbable, and so you can get a lot more with less, essentially. And there's different kinds. I think they say that it's the magnesium lactate that's particularly good for the bowel for constipation, but this dimagnesium malate is supposed to be great too. So
You have tend more towards diarrhea. Do you just even want to mess with? Because I've had bad experiences with. I think that's what caused it. Crohn's flare.
yeah,
Magnesium. So
I probably wouldn't. If you have diarrhea, I probably wouldn't. Let your body balance a little more, and a hair mineral test will help you know. That's a good starting point. It's a fairly inexpensive way of getting an overall picture of your minerals. So if you have constipation, it's pretty much guaranteed you need more magnesium. If you don't, then get a hair mineral test, and then you can see kind of a bigger picture.
Do you have a, like, amount recommendation, or like, if, you know, if you were to take the magnesium supplement, would you just kind of, whatever?
I started with a pretty large amount until my stool started loosening, and then I just backed off. So
Do you still,
I've-
even with your regular, you still?
I'm
take it?
still staying on it, just kind of a maintenance dose, and it's helping. So I don't know how long I'll stay on it, but I think, oh, I just had a magnesium deficiency. That would have been nice to know. I mean, I knew about magnesium, but I always knew about magnesium in the form of like, ow, painful, laxative, you know. But anyway, the chelate form actually gets to where it needs to go in the body to help restore the balance. Saltwater baths and magnesium oil baths can help. Eating slowly, sitting down, not overeating is pretty critical if you have constipation. So I'm talking about this largely like magnesium is this magic tool, but you have to realize there's other elements of activating your parasympathetic system, which are those things I talked about, like praying, meditating, yoga, breathing, taking that time for stillness, for your, you know, kind of connect to your body, releasing your toxic emotions, and gratitude.
So it just said drink soul.
Oh yeah, okay, that's another thing I've been doing, which is huge. Because I'm not a big fan of like just picking one mineral and going haywire on it, because I think how minerals work, when I talk about the complexity of mineral absorption, you have to have all of them, really. So Leslie put on the blog about soul therapy, is that how you say it, or soleil therapy, where you use look on their blog, it explains you use the rock crystals and you get it to a perfect like 26% saturation of salt. So I've been taking that every day. And honestly, initially I didn't really notice anything, but over time, I think it really does help restore the balance. You may notice something dramatic, I don't know, but I just think you've got to have, you still need calcium, you still need all of these things. But so if you take things like, I drink the Soleil in the morning, and then I usually drink the Redmond Clay in the afternoon or the evening. And I think the combination of those two is just getting absorbable minerals into my body. It is very high magnesium. So that's why I feel like it's a real balancer for me. Anyway.
So do you, like, you know, anytime you go for a drink of water, is that what you drink instead of?
I just do it in the morning. You just put a teaspoon, I sometimes do too, I don't know, it's bad to do that, but it's really, like, you don't need a lot, and it works energetically in your body, it works systemically in your body, and read about it, read what Leslie wrote about it, but you really just take a small amount. I suppose you could take more, but I do that in the morning, and then I do the clay once or twice in the day, and the clay is a great detoxifier too, so. The Real Foods blog. Yeah, Real Foods Market.
So it's interesting. I've had constipation most of my life. In fact, I think my mother was giving me enemas at 5 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So, and one of the things is his hair test showed that I had high calcium levels.
Interesting.
Very high calcium levels, actually not being absorbed into the system. What has actually solved it is drinking 50 ounces of water every morning when I get up.
Yeah.
I mean, I drink 50 ounces when I get up, and it has completely taken care of the constipation.
Interesting.
Yeah. I drink more water. I mean, I'm drinking about 120 ounces of water a day.
Right.
But I drink 50 ounces when I
In the morning. A lot of people say that it's pretty critical to get the bulk of your water in the morning before you eat, and give your body time before you eat.
I don't do anything for
Yeah.
I don't eat, drink, anything.
You kind of have to wake up your system.
Yeah.
What if, okay, and that's, you know, I've read, you know, she in the book talks about waiting and stuff. What if you feel, I mean, you know, I've had hypoglycemia and stuff.
Yeah.
What if you just, I mean, you just
I would
start feeling
probably
really weak and,
start with some water, and maybe 15 or 20 minutes later do juice, fresh juice. I know the juicing helps. The juice is like a parasympathetic food. it's like opening, I think is what they call it. Like if you get into the yin and yang of food or whatever, juice helps to kind of open your bowels. So, and it might help with the blood sugar.
And just kind of wait.
And then wait probably 30 minutes or so if you can. So you might have to kind of adapt that a little bit.
I was having that, and I don't know, and you're pretty early on in the stages. I couldn't do the water and juice. I was so hypoglycemic, I was so hungry, and she recommends the g.a.p.s milkshake.
The g.a.p.s milkshake,
when
yes.
You put in like a spoon of the fermented cream, that made the biggest difference.
That
And
recipe is.
Then I can wait to eat, So yeah, that made a difference. I don't know if you're there yet, but.
She was just saying for the camera, if people have hypoglycemia issues and can't do just the water or the juice in the morning, to do the g.a.p.s milkshake, which is in the constipation handout. So you add you can do raw egg yolks and the cream. If you're doing yogurt, if you're not doing yogurt yet, just do the raw egg yolks, and that might help. So anyway, but I really do think that balancing your nervous system and getting your mineral balance correct, and it might be larger quantities of magnesium and potassium, is pretty critical. Do you drink mineral water?
I don't.
Okay.
Well, yes, I do. In actuality, I actually drink a chlorophyll water.
Okay.
So I drink a chlorophyll water
Oh.
all day long.
Okay, like the pearl water, that kind of
Actually,
thing?
no, it's Live.
Okay.
It's Live International.
Okay, well,
Drinks
chlorophyll
Live.
water is extremely high in magnesium.
Yes, and so
So,
I drink that all
yeah.
day. So I drink the 50 ounces in the morning, and then I drink 2 40-ounce containers
Yeah.
of chlorophyll during the day.
Okay. So, yeah, it could have a pretty large magnesium component and
Well, it's got
hydration.
It's got fulvic minerals.
Fulvic minerals, yes, exactly, which are highly absorbable to the body. So,
Yeah.
anyway, so for those of you who don't suffer from constipation, thank you for enduring this
Yeah.
conversation. But again, things that magnesium and balancing the nervous system can treat these are just like a literal blink of things that it helps with. So, anyway, your healing journey continues and it goes on. g.a.p.s diet FAQ and g.a.p.s.me FAQ section is literally 105 pages long, I think. She just answers questions weekly that people email to her, and it'll take you your whole life to get through it, but it's pretty fascinating. I've had several emails about what you do at social gatherings. We just bring our own food, and we're just totally quiet about it. We're not trying to convince anyone else to do g.a.p.s. We're not trying to convince anyone why we're doing g.a.p.s. We just do it. And if they ask us questions, we answer really simple answers about it, but I don't know. I just have been in too many situations where it was challenging, so I don't know. We just walk our peaceful healing path is kind of what we say. So, cheating, it sets your healing back. Once you go through the intense phases of intro, just keep plugging on. You get to the point where you can eat more and you'll feel better. And my motto is health is a blessing, and it's worth working for. So. We went clear at 8 o'clock, but do you have questions? Do you have questions that you want to address that we didn't address?
Well, that kind of took care of my question.
I'm so glad. That constipation thing is just frustrating and hard to deal with.
Well, I was going to ask you, I don't know, maybe I need to just write and keep track more, but I seem to have a hard time distinguishing between detox, diet, or a reaction, or, I mean, usually, most days, feeling the weakness,
Yeah.
tiredness, which kind of, that probably leads to irritability.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
But, anyways, but yeah, how, it's just kind of how you distinguish between what a reaction to the food versus
Were you highly allergic to foods prior to starting g.a.p.s?
I know that I was reacting to something. I hadn't really identified it yet. I'm suspecting dairy was probably one of them. I haven't introduced that
Do you
yet.
feel a lot of those same symptoms, have those subsided at all?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, within the first day of it, I couldn't believe how much better my gut felt. And so, but then the constipation kicked in. So now I'm kind of hey, is that just? I don't know. I kind of have a hard time distinguishing Because I mean, I haven't eaten anything and also I'm like, whoa.
Yeah.
You know, so.
You're probably safe to keep moving forward. And that's why I say a lot of the improvement is so subtle, you almost don't notice it's happening. But sometimes keeping yourself back waiting for perfection, it's not going to happen, you know? Like, so if you feel relatively good, weakness is really common in the beginning because your body is going through so many changes and so much detoxification. And that's why next time I think we'll talk about detoxification, kind of some things you can do to help yourself through it. I don't know if detoxification baths help you or if you have access to like an infrared sauna or anything like that that can maybe up your assistance to detoxification and see if that improves. If that improves it, then it's probably largely die-off symptoms and you probably just keep going forward. If it doesn't improve it at all, you may have an underlying condition. And magnesium, again, I'm totally picking on magnesium tonight, can be one of those.
I'm going to try that.
Magnesium is responsible for exciting your muscles again, and weakness is a sign of magnesium deficiency. So.
Yeah. In my experience, when I've done cleanses and had die-off, which is just miserable. Yeah. The resin clay is amazingly helpful, especially when it's abdominal. You know, it'll absorb these free radicals and things that you stirred up. It's going to absorb them and just help you
Eliminate them.
Do you just do the, you know, make a pitcher of water with it, or like how do you use it, or do you just stir it in?
In your case, I would say the pitcher of water is going to be the best thing. And when I've used it, instead, I create like a paste. And then, it might sound funny, but this is the easiest way for me. I take a spoonful of the paste and then shoot the water down after and shake it down. So I kind of swallow it like a big pill. But you could buy it in caps, but the only reason I don't buy it in caps is I don't want
To have to one more thing to break down. I agree.
So I just take a spoonful and I don't mind it. And
So
then I
it's
drink
like,
it.
okay, because I did start doing, well, I did it and then I dropped it for some reason, but just kind of take, it, you know, it has the recommended to, you know, take 1 to 2 teaspoons of the clay a day.
Very helpful. Another thing that's also helpful is you can do the baths with the bath salt and take half a cup of clay.
Yes.
But don't you worry because that's also
Oh, I know.
putting good minerals into the tub, helping you pull and detoxify more effectively. And so I really like the clay and salt. And if you need a little lavender in there, I don't think that's going to throw off.
Oh no, the essential oils I wish I would have used more essential oils initially to help, just with the energetic healing, you know. But I agree with you. I mean, we do a lot of detox baths at our house, and by far the red one clay, I sweat the most with that one. And it's interesting because I always feel like my feet tingling in the bath whenever I'm in like a Redmond clay bath, and your feet are, you know, have large pores, so they're big detoxifiers. And I think that might help you if you just up your detoxification assistance. Another thing you may consider is coffee enemas. I'm not sure if you're comfortable with that.
I did one. I didn't really.
You have to do them pretty consistently. If you look on the like the Gerson Cancer Institute, that's the protocol that Dr. McBride recommends. You sometimes start out with like 4 to 5 a week, and then you go down to 2 to 3 a week, and then down to 1 a week, and then every other week, and then maintenance dose every month. So it helps with liver support, but it's hugely helpful for constipation because it reactivates peristalsis in the bowels. So I would try upping your detoxification support and see how you feel. If you don't feel any better, you may have something underlying that might need to be addressed.
I've had all these issues too, and I've kind of gone through some of this stuff, but castor oil packs on your abdomen,
bells,
on the
yeah.
liver is also very helpful. And whenever I do that in a detoxification, it'll up my energy the next day. And that's super nice to get that. Oh yeah, I woke up and I felt good the next day. So you take, I can explain it, you take castor oil, and this is always on the internet, all these people that have done it. Castor oil, rub it on your belly, get a saturated flannel cloth, saturated in castor oil, and wrung out, and then you put that over, and then you put a warm water bottle on top of that, and I stay there for about an hour. Sometimes I just fall asleep that way. It's really nice.
It does
That's
feel
very
good.
helpful.
Okay, did that answer she was asking for the camera so you know about this whole discussion we just had about how to know the difference between die-off versus something that might be underlying and how to know whether you can move on. So it's tricky and very individual. Any other questions? Yes.
Exercise recommended in the early stages? 'Cause I thought one of your slides said exercise.
And I recommend exercise as a big picture part of your life. At the right appropriate time, incorporate that into your life. My body's not very happy when I don't exercise, but I know in those early phases of g.a.p.s, I did not because I was so weak. And I don't know that it would have been the wisest idea to go and push myself harder when I was already so weak, but yoga or something like that would be really helpful. So I think something like that, which is also going to help activate the parasympathetic system, would be good, but don't push it. I actually love to do interval training if anyone's familiar with that, and I think I might have pushed myself a little bit too hard on that early on and had a little bit of adrenal imbalance for a while because I just think I was going a little too gung-ho. So just work with your body on that. I think it's important for detoxification. It gets the bowels moving, it gets the lymphatic system flowing, so it's good. But if you're so weak and tired, don't push yourself. Take it one thing at a time. That's why, I know this next little while is going to be all about the diet for you. But then when you get to a point of a little more healing, then start incorporating some other things. But do yoga if you can. Don't even put pressure on yourself to do it every day. Once a week, whatever you can do.
I cut back to like once a week and started feeling really lazy, but I'm like, I just don't have the energy for it.
I know, to a certain extent, allow yourself the healing. Like, I think most people who do g.a.p.s are probably somewhat intense personalities to take it on. And so you have to give yourself a lot of mercy. I still am emotionally working on being able to do that, being able to allow myself healing time and allow myself rejuvenation time without it being a bad thing or neglecting something else that's more important. Your healing is in large part your highest priority right now. And because you heal, you get to do all those things later. So
One question.
I'm gonna have you guys start saying your questions.
Okay, so when you're doing the first stages, do you, I see on the constipation, you say green drink powders. I usually drink a fresh green drink.
Yeah. Juicing.
I actually, there's a great woman in Salt Lake City that makes it by the gallon. And so I can just pour it right out in the morning. Is that recommended?
Absolutely. Fresh is always recommended, but it's just not feasible for some people, and not all people have juicers. So it's highly recommended that when you're juicing, you're doing like real juicing where it's masticating the fiber out. Later you can get into blending and smoothies and things like that, but not all people have access to that. And Dr. McBride says she's okay with the grass juices like barley and wheatgrass if your bowel tolerates it. So I don't know that ours would have initially, but we're at the point now, we love it. We drink that Ormus greens all the time and love it, so. Do you have any questions? Okay, what about you guys? No? Okay. Yes.
Okay, I went down to see what magnesium products you had. I was wondering if you want to look at them and speak to any of them.
Yes, I'd love to.
It says it's
Chelated?
chelated.
Yeah.
Thank you. And these are some that you put
Oh,
on the
yes.
that people
These
raved about these.
this is the best brand of magnesium oil. Like, I knew you guys would carry these. I really did. If it's a good brand, you guys carry it. This magnesium oil, you can rub it topically on your skin. Look online, there's a million different protocols of how to do it. You can rub it on here. People rub it on certain areas where it's highly absorbable into the bloodstream. But bathing in this, the protocol that I keep seeing over and over is bathing in 2 ounces of it. You can put, you can do just magnesium oil, or you can do salt water and magnesium oil. So, basically we're looking to the sea for our cure, because the sea is a perfect balance of all the minerals. So, but you just need a little more magnesium to help yourself out. And then, the mineral support, yeah. See, this is 95 milligrams of magnesium to 41 milligrams of calcium. So this is an incredible ratio. It's hard to find anything out there with this ratio. And it's going to help you with detoxification too. I mean, people take this, they get food poisoning or whatever, you know, to help neutralize the toxins in your gut. And so you're going to get a lot of benefits from this clay. I mean, is there like a threshold to how much you should or shouldn't drink?
No, they've never had any problems with clay.
'Cause,
Studies have been wonderful. In fact, there are two different types of clay that can be.
I'm going to have you say this on camera. No? Okay, never mind. Oh, yeah.
Clay, and then there's like a calcium clay. One is actually an expanding clay that actually bentonite actually expands.
Yes.
Calcium clays or the other kinds of clays do not expand, but they feed and they're very high
Right.
mineral content.
Right.
They have different ones.
Yeah.
This one is high in magnesium compared to the other, which is not. And so, yeah, you just really want to know your clay, because you want the hot one that's high in magnesium unless you're trying to tackle other problems.
Right. So,
That's okay, I didn't want it.
no, I got it. Pretty much stick with Redmond clay. And honestly, across the board, whenever I'm reading discussions on it online, it's across the world, basically, everyone's agreeing Redmond clay is the best. So no one's paying me to say that. No one's giving me Redmond clay. I just, honestly, from my own experience, it is awesome stuff.
Just as a piece, Melissa, they actually say that the clays that are like the Redmond clay, you could actually live on. They
Right.
have so many
minerals.
nutrients, they even have protein in them.
Mhm.
They have so many nutrients, they have so many minerals that you could literally just eat the clay and survive.
Well, it's interesting because one of magnesium's big jobs is protein synthesis. You cannot even synthesize proteins without enough magnesium, which is again why I think some people may struggle on the diet figuring out their balance. You know, people are like, I can't absorb meats or whatever. Well, maybe you have a magnesium deficiency because you should be able to, you know. So, yeah, this is a magnesium amino acid chelate. I think this would be a good one to try. Magnesium oxide. So, yeah, I think this would, Solar Ray is always a good brand. You may have to play around with the one that you try, but anyway, any other questions? Insights? Anything anyone wants to share? Is everyone going to keep going on the diet? Yeah? Yeah? That is the way you feel. You're just like, I know. And I can just promise you, like, if you stick with it, whether it's a year for you or 2 years for you, honestly, by about a year, my daughter had healed above and beyond what I was expecting. So we kind of started letting her branch out. But whatever the time frame is for you, you'll be so glad you did it because your life will have changed. You know, when I look at where we are now versus then, it is still intense. You know, I still put a lot of thought and effort into food, but our life has changed, you know, so it's good. But I don't have time to demo the bone broth, but I did bring g.a.p.s if you guys want to taste that because it's high in magnesium. It's a great detoxifier and it's loaded with probiotics. So do you guys want to try some? Okay. I did for quite a while, but then we started raising our own cows. So bones are hard to come by. I didn't go through all of the things I listed on there, but the organ meat is one of the best things to restore magnesium, one of the highest magnesium foods you can eat. Bone broth and organ meat's number one. So I list those somewhere in the presentation. So anyway, but the fact of the matter is you got to heal your gut so you're absorbing the minerals from the food too. So it's a complex process. Anyway, okay, well, thank you.